we can hardly help being enraptured by the next phase of Eleanor's most extraordinary and dramatic life. It reads like the most romantic of swashbuckling fictions. Twice on her way home to Aquitaine, after her divorce or annulment from Louis, Eleanor was almost captured and kidnapped by young nobles apparently intent on having her and gaining her lands. Thus, in marriage lay her greatest safety. On May 18th of the year 1152, not quite 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor married the Angevin Henry, later known as Henry Plantagenet, who was about 10 years her junior. The bond between them appears to have been authentically passionate, based on a sympathy of physical and political desires. They wanted each other, a kingdom to rule, a brood to raise. With her backing and resources, her new husband soon claimed the English throne as Henry II. Together, they ruled and had 8 children, 7 of whom lived into adulthood. What a story. Let's look at its background. Because it's all about questions of male and female inheritance, which are still coming back to revisit us in the life and story of Eleanor. Earlier now, from about 1150 to 1152, the historical record was silent regarding Eleanor, but during this time, Geoffrey of Anjou and his son Henry approached Louis, King of France, to ask his aid in recovering the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy. They were seeking these lands by the right of Geoffrey's wife, Matilda, who was the sole direct heiress of Henry I of England, whose claims to England had been overridden at her father's death by her cousin, Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. Like Matilda, Stephen was the offspring of a child of William the Conqueror. Stephen was the son of William's daughter Adela, and Matilda was the daughter of Henry I. But it was Stephen who gained the throne of England, the nephew, and the marriage of his son, Eustace, to Louis VII's sister Constance strengthened the ties between Stephen and the French crown. In 1150, however, fundamentally important Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis took the side of Stephen's adversaries and encouraged Geoffrey of Anjou and Matilda to make peace with Louis VII, and also persuaded them to promise to protect the Norman lands of Saint-Denis if war should break out. Thus, the great Abbot Suger can be held in some measure responsible for the encounter between the 17-year-old Henry and Eleanor, then 26, that led in less than 3 years to their marriage. Louis went to war on behalf of the Angevins. He helped them conquer Normandy, and he bestowed the duchy on Henry. As his reward, Louis received not only Henry's liege homage, but also some very precious Norman territories bordering his own land, near the site where, in 50 years, Richard I of England, the son of Eleanor and Henry, would build the famous Chateau Gaillard. This success hardly eclipsed the serious problems that Louis faced. His reputation had been tarnished by the failure of the crusade. His campaign on the Angevins' behalf did not serve his own long-term interests very well. Whether motivated by guilt prompted at the crusade's outcome, or simply worn out by Eleanor, Louis VII in 1152 was ready for his separation from a woman who had brought him only daughters and distress. Had the Abbot Suger not died in 1151, he might have kept the king and queen from separating. But as it was, Louis arranged to have his relatives inform him that there was some blood impediment to his marriage, which Eleanor had already told him about at Antioch. At this point, Louis was doubtless eager to rid himself of this wife, and a final breach ensued. So despite other desires, Louis's kin took solemn oaths testifying to the closeness of his blood with Eleanor's, and the chief prelates of France proclaimed their divorce on March 21st of 1152. Eleanor departed from Poitiers at once, leaving her husband of 15 years and her 2 daughters, who were then respectively 7 years and 18 months old. A curious amalgam of impulsiveness and calculated shrewdness, Eleanor seems to have known precisely what she would do when her divorce from Louis was accomplished. Eleanor demanded the return of her duchy, even though Louis balked. Not until August of 1154 did he cease calling himself the Duke of the Aquitaine. Did he cease using the seal he had used ever since he was married to Eleanor. Louis's reluctance to leave Eleanor's land cannot be explained solely by his desire to guard his daughter's interests. Could it have been piqued by Eleanor's marriage after him and all of her adventures? First, Thibaut of Blois, who would later marry Alice, the younger daughter of Eleanor of Louis, and then Geoffrey of Anjou, Henry's younger brother and their father's namesake, attempted to waylay Eleanor as she journeyed towards Aquitaine, and each was apparently intent on making her their own. There are wonderful stories of Eleanor's escape from these men who were trying to kidnap and marry her. Then, on May 18th of 1152, within 2 months of the divorce, Eleanor married Henry, who had become Count of Anjou on his father's death the preceding September. Louis, however, continued to call himself the Duke of the Aquitaine. He summoned Henry to his court, he confiscated his lands when Henry failed to appear, and he captured 2 of his most important Norman castles. For his part, Henry moved cautiously with Louis, the King of France, refraining from assuming the title Duke of Aquitaine until early 1153. Between divorce and the early months of her own remarriage, Eleanor solidified her control over Aquitaine, issuing grants and charters in her own independent name. Once she married Henry, he swiftly exerted control over her and the Aquitaine, where he was popular. But she also maintained for some time, we don't know exactly how long, her lordly status. Soon after their marriage, however, Eleanor visited her own Abbey of Fontevraud for the first time. Happily enough, Henry's family also had a long link to that particular monastery. At that time, for instance, his Aunt Matilda was abbess. Eleanor granted this monastery a new charter, which it is worth hearing. After being joined, she says, to my most very noble Lord Henry, most noble Count of the Angevins, by bond of matrimony, divine inspiration led me to want to visit the sacred congregation of the Virgins of Fontevraud, and by the grace of God I have been able to realize this intention. Thus have I come to Fontevraud, guided by God. I have crossed the threshold where the sisters are gathered, and here, with heartfelt emotion, I have approved, conceded, and affirmed all that my fathers and forebears had given to God in the Church of Fontevraud, and in particular this gift of 500 sous in the coinage of Poitou, made by myself and my Lord Louis, King of France, in the days when he was my husband. So we see her confirming in her own name and in the name of her marriage with Henry a particular grant which she had given when she was married to Louis, which of course would have been invalidated, it was thought, by the unmaking of that marriage and her new marriage. This charter was sealed with a new image of Eleanor as Duchess of Aquitaine and Normandy, and hence as Henry's bride. Though the wax seal, which survives today in the archives of France, is in poor condition, we can still discern a slender woman in a graceful long gown, wearing a veil, and holding in her hands a flower, perhaps a fleur-de-lis, and a bird, perhaps a hawk. It is crucial for us to remember that with or without Eleanor's ready assent, marriage transferred first to Louis VII and then to Henry II crucial aspects of her lordship. Henry was a compelling, gloriously handsome, charismatic young man whose line was said to have descended from the devil. He had red gold hair and an excellent physique, and he was liberal, we're told, in public, although he was frugal in private. A complex, wary, self-assured, intelligent, and unusually literate man, He was remarked to have said that he was remarkably polished in letters. He had been trained early on in the farther reaches of England, may well have known even the stories of King Arthur as a young man. And now when he comes to Eleanor, still in his bright youth, he is ready to assume the kingship of England. The couple, on the other hand, committed a kind of feudal treason by marrying without the permission of their overlord. But since Louis was their overlord, would he ever have given them that permission? They were stuck in a quandary. Louis would never have allowed his former wife and one of his most aggressive rivals to marry. He would immediately have perceived the danger of having Eleanor's vast property allied to the Angevin Henry's. Not only would this collective territory have been 10 times larger than Louis's own, it also stretched from the English Channel to the mountains of the Pyrenees. Henry and Eleanor achieved the first of their dynastic and personal goals when, on August the 17th of 1153, their son William, named for her and for her ancestors, was born. His birth was soon matched by the death of King Stephen's son, Eustace of Blois. While Eleanor was pregnant, Henry defeated King Stephen in England, thus confirming his military prowess and his right to royal prerogative. The death of King Stephen's heir left the way clear for Henry's accession to the English throne. Thus the year 1153 came tied in a ribbon for Henry, since the Treaty of Winchester of November 1153 acknowledged that Henry would be the next king. At this point, Henry had brought Eleanor from Poitiers to his Normandy, close to the English Channel. After King Stephen's death, in October of 1154, Eleanor and Henry sailed for England, and they were crowned King and Queen of England on December 19th in Westminster Abbey. As Plantagenets, the dynasty had been founded that would rule England for the next 331 years. At 30, now Queen of England, Eleanor enjoyed Europe-wide fame. She was lauded in conventional ways, and her compelling desirability was also celebrated, as in the song from the Carmina Burana collection. If all the world were mine, from the seashore to the Rhine, that price were not too high to have England's queen lie close in my arms. Henry II quickly found himself facing difficulties brought on by his continental military campaigns to maintain the Norman side of his duchy, and his feudal campaigns to revive Eleanor's claims to Toulouse, and his constant diplomatic negotiations. In the latter 1160s, he was embroiled as well in fights with his former best friend and chancellor, whom he had made Archbishop, Thomas à Becket, whose murder he caused and for whose martyrdom he was thus responsible. Having chosen this man of the middle classes, having lifted Becket from a position of being simply one of the ordinary sort of men in Norman England, Henry gave him the position of Chancellor of England in order that he protect Henry's best interests in the long-term Plantagenet goals. When the English church began to give Henry troubles, insisting that it was the prerogative of the bishop and not of the king to appoint bishops, it was at that point that Henry thought it wise to make Becket Archbishop of Canterbury, giving him lordship, that is, over the entire English church, and knowing that Henry would remain loyal just as Becket would remain loyal to him. What happened then was one of the tragedies of human failures that we see so often with those who love each other as much as Becket and Henry II loved each other. They ceased to understand each other. Becket began to understand the position of the bishops. He transferred not just his status in life, but his loyalty to the church, he said, and to the things of God. He would not support Henry's strategy of making sure that the state remained superior to the church. Becket acting independently against the will of Henry, so annoyed Henry that Henry is known to have said at one point, "Will no one rid me of that man?" Some of his own warriors, listening to this, found their way into the Cathedral of Canterbury in Christmas time, when Becket, who seemed to have known that they would be coming, dressed himself up in the full regalia of the bishop and went to say Mass at midnight. At that moment, the knives came out. Becket was slaughtered on the altar of his own church. What could be more perfect as a site of martyrdom? Teresa of Avila should have been able to find such a parallel. With Becket's death, people, the church, went into mourning, grief, horror struck England. Henry was excommunicated and the land was put under interdict. People were not allowed to be buried or married in the church. Babies were not allowed to be baptized. And it was all put on Henry's doorstep. An attempt was made in many directions. Attempts were made to make sure that Henry would be able to reconcile with his people and with the church. There were all sorts of troubles from the perimeters of England. In Wales, for instance, a young prince named Arthur came forward claiming that he was the reborn King Arthur who had come to save his people from this horrible Frenchman, this Henry, who had come to take over authority. Henry himself claims to have had a dream in which he saw that the actual King Arthur was buried at Glastonbury, and the monks at Glastonbury dug up a tomb and coffin which said on its front, "Here lies buried Arthur, the once and future king," with his second wife, Guinevere. All of this is going on at the same time that Henry and Eleanor are living together, and we know not one word of what Eleanor thought of Becket or of the whole situation of civil and clerical unrest in England. During this long period from their marriage in 1152 until 1168, Eleanor performed a multitude of tasks in tandem with Henry. Many of those tasks involved the bearing of babies. Together they had at least 8 children. Others may have died in childbirth or in infancy. 6 of these children lived into adulthood. Their eldest, William, lived for only 2 years and died in 1156. But after that, they had Henry, 1155, Matilda, 1156, Richard, 1157, Geoffrey, 1158, Eleanor, 1161, Johanna, 1165, and John, born in 1167. Adding to the physical burden of pregnancy was a role that Eleanor seemed to relish, of being regent of the kingdom in Henry's frequent absence. She herself traveled frequently and often selected children, one or another or several of her children, to accompany her. Her public role and political role started to diminish in 1163 when Henry took a more aggressive hand in controlling the affairs of the kingdom. Between 1163 and 1170, Henry was in his prime. Involved in his contest with Becket, he aggressively controlled the affairs of the kingdom, as Eleanor was relegated to traveling, appearing at Christmas courts, and producing the last of her children. A striking change occurred in 1168 when Eleanor assumed, at Henry's wish, control of the Duchy of Aquitaine. The fact that Henry set Eleanor over to Aquitaine after the death of his mother Matilda in the fall of 1167 suggests, according to historian Peggy Brown, a real impulse on his part to free himself from the control and perhaps annoyance of powerful women. With his mother removed by death, his wife could be sent off to the continent. This step served his immediate interests. He was 35, and with his 44-year-old wife occupied in the Aquitaine, he could indulge his appetites and rule his lands as he wished. Had Henry foreseen the long-term consequences of dispatching Eleanor to Aquitaine, he might have decided to keep her at his side. Had he understood that his soldiers would have murdered Becket, he might have decided to keep his mouth shut. We know that he did long and hard penance for the death of Becket, abasing himself to his people, to the church, to the Pope. But he also did long-term penance for abandoning Eleanor. From this time on, Eleanor's ambitions were centered on her children and their fortunes. According to most historians, she was not primarily interested with fostering their development, but interested in using them in her struggles against Henry. No exaggeration to say that his mother's death and Eleanor's absence in the Aquitaine marked the end of a very great love affair. They saw each other on rare occasions after that. Henry remained a famous philanderer, an adept wielder of power over all except his family. Eleanor, who concentrated on her children's destinies, was locked in an endless struggle. Was Henry's attention what she wanted? Did he reject her because she was too old, too knowing, too powerful, and herself too accustomed to wielding authority? Henry made a series of errors or time-consuming diplomatic mistakes that marred his reign. The Treaty of Montmirail with Louis VII in 1169 split his French lands among Henry's sons, one of whom, Richard, became engaged to Louis's daughter by his third wife, Alice. Alice then came to live at Henry's court, and the relationship between Henry and Alice gave scandal. Not the relationship between Richard and Alice, but Richard's father, Henry. In June 1170, the Archbishop of York crowned young Henry as heir presumptive. This was a mistake in itself and an insult to Henry's former closest friend with whom he had raised from obscurity to become the impressive, as I said, but independent Chancellor Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who was then still alive. And it was only after that point, on December 29th of 1170, that Becket was murdered in the cathedral at Canterbury. In June 1172, in Eleanor's presence, 15-year-old Richard was installed as Duke of the Aquitaine. Young Henry was crowned a second time in the fall of 1172. Thus, as is noted, Henry gave his sons the trappings without the reality of power, and inadvertently strengthened the ties that bound his sons to France. By raising his sons in namesake to the kingship, following Capetian rather than English practice, Henry created in his child a jealous rival and at least one potential ally for his disaffected and now independent wife, who acquired a virtual consort when their son Richard became Duke of the Aquitaine, as she was its Duchess. Furthermore, through his part in the Becket affair, Henry advanced the decline of his own popularity and authority. Trouble was brewing. It erupted shortly after Raymond of Toulouse did homage to Henry and to Richard as Count of Poitou, note, not to Eleanor, in February of 1173 in Limoges. Eleanor may have been disturbed at being excluded from the ceremony. If she was, she did not have to wait long for revenge. As Raymond is said to have informed Henry, the English king's family were conspiring against him, and battle was soon joined. Eleanor played an essential part in her own son's rebellion against their father. If she didn't motivate it, she certainly joined it. She may even have deliberately inspired it. Understandably, then, her husband had her seized. For the rest of his life, She was secluded and closely guarded wherever she was, in England or in the continent. For 15 years, Henry used her as he struggled with his sons. Her being kept in confinement did not bring peace, and a period of intense conflict culminated upon the death of the young Henry in July of 1183. Henry was watching his sons drop, but his wife's anger, his anger with her, persisted. So Eleanor worked to advance what she saw as the goals of her sons against those of her husband. It was very easy to do because they had titles without authority, and she had the Aquitaine. The sons rebelled against their father, and by 1174, Henry kept her in captivity. Her whereabouts were usually unmentioned, and he kept her either under guard or in his eyesight for more than a decade. She would be paraded out on certain limited state occasions when it pleased Henry, and otherwise she was kept in careful, if elegant and luxurious, confinement. During this time, Eleanor helped arrange the marriages of her daughter, but she concentrated particularly on her sons, on the shoals of their rebellious relations with their father. What little was left of her great partnership with Henry simply broke. As Eleanor and Henry struggled, he lost popularity, she lost him, and they both lost their son, Henry the young king, to an early death. In the end, their sons, Richard and John, joined with Philip of France, son of Louis of France, in a final rebellion against Henry II, who capitulated on July 4th of 1189. He died at Chinon, that castle where Joan of Arc would later meet her Dauphin. He died 2 days later without the comfort of the presence of his wife or any of his sons. He was not given the sumptuous death so beloved of the high chivalric period. What were his last words? Well recorded for all of us to remember as we think back on this king. Shame, shame upon a conquered king. Rather than being buried in England, upon the recommendation of William Marshall, that flower of chivalry, Henry II was sent back to the Aquitaine, the place of his wife, the place where he had wooed and won her, to Fontevraud, which brought together the interests of both of their families, but to the monastery controlled by her line and by abbesses over men. He was sent back to Fontevraud to be buried. This tells us as much as anything can how loose the notion of nationhood was in the time of Abelard and Eloise, of Hildegard, of Eleanor, of Louis, and of Henry. How loose the notion of nationhood was, and how intertwined were the French and English by blood and by desire. One cannot separate out on the basis of the tongues they spoke or the interests they shared those whom we now call English from those whom we now call French. But this moment in which Henry was buried at Fontevraud marked the beginning of Fontevraud as a royal and family burial place. And now, it is said, Eleanor was, in many different respects, liberated. Liberated by Henry's death, and she swiftly began the many open travels on the wide roads that marked her long and fruitful widowhood.